Hello and welcome to my May reading wrap-up. I had a really good reading month in May. I had, I think, 2 5-stars and a number of 4-stars, and I got through Lord of the Rings, which, like, let's be real, not that enjoyable, massive accomplishment, so I'm feeling really good about this. I read 11 books. I'm gonna get into all of them now. That was spleen. But yes, let's get into them. The first book that I read in May was These Fleeting Shadows by Kate Alice Marshall. This is a young adult horror novel about a teenage girl who inherits her family's old, potentially haunted, creepy happenings home. It's a massive mansion, like very wealthy. She inherits all the money, but in order to get the money and the house, she has to stay on the grounds of Harrow for 1 whole year. And it basically just gets into like these horror happenings and like there are bad things going on, and she's kind of trying to investigate with like one of her cousins and a groundskeeper, and you know, things happen, bad things happen. But 5 stars. It was a really wonderful book. This was recommended by Spines and Spoilers, who I will link down below, and I have a whole full review on this book, which I will also link down below. It was wonderful. I am not usually a horror lover, but this book was absolutely stunning. I loved it. It talks so much about just like family and what truly makes a monster, and the writing was gorgeous and the relationships were gorgeous, and I loved the main character, and the plot twist at the end was really well done, and just the exploration after the plot twist and like what that twist meant to the story was amazing. I really enjoyed every aspect of this book. Like, I wasn't expecting one of my favorite books to be a horror novel, but it was. So I definitely need to read more Kate Alice Marshall. If you're trying to like get into horror, if you want to like try some because you haven't really enjoyed any, highly recommend. It was gorgeous. It was stunning. It was everything to me. I'm not gonna get too into it just because I do have that for review, but wonderful, wonderful book. Then I read Into the Raging Sea, 33 Mariners, 1 Megastorm, and The Sinking of El Faro by Rachel Slade. This I listened to on audiobook. This is a nonfiction book about the sinking of El Faro, which occurred in 2016. It was a container ship on the way to Puerto Rico at the time that Hurricane Joaquin happened in the Bermuda Triangle and sunk the ship. I also gave this 5 stars. I can't tell you exactly why. Like, I know nothing about this. Like, I feel like when I talk about nonfiction, it's important to like mention when I come from a place of absolute ignorance, I know nothing about container ships. I know nothing about the maritime industry. Like, I'd heard of Hurricane Joaquin. I remember Hurricane Joaquin. Did not remember the sinking of El Faro. All 33 people on board died. It was a horrific event. I knew nothing about it, and I know nothing about this, but it was so well done. Like, it was a fantastic book. It was so interesting, and it reminded me a lot of Jon Krakauer, and especially Into Thin Air, in the way he just, like, details this whole, I guess, traumatic event, like, from start to finish. Like, the first portion of the book covers the people on the ship and what was happening on the ship, because while everyone involved died, they had the black box that had recorded, like, the previous, I think it was like 26 hours. So they had 26 hours of recording of conversations in the, again, my ignorance is showing. I want to say cockpit, but I know that's airplanes. The wheelhouse, I think, maybe. But she basically took those conversations and interviews with the family and friends and like emails that had been sent out and constructed the story of what happened on the ship. And then she took it off the ship and what was happening with Hurricane Joaquin, what happened after the fact with the suing of the shipping company. And it was really, really fascinating and well done. Like, I kind of just picked this up on a whim because I needed an audiobook to listen to on my way to work. And it was so good. Like, I was utterly engrossed the whole time. It was the kind of thing where like I was like, what if there's like an extra 20 minutes of traffic on my way home and I just like get to listen to more of this, because I was so into the book. I also cried a little bit while reading this. Not very much. It was more of like I teared up a little, but had I been reading the physical copy, I probably would have like actually cried. I was just driving at the time listening to an audiobook, but it was like the emotion was there, and she spent so much time with the crew members and with the crew members' families, that you really got to know them and got attached to these people and like really cared for them, which I enjoyed. The only thing that I kind of had a small issue with was that I don't think Rachel Slade put enough blame on the shipping company, which was Tote. If you want to Google this, essentially Tote blamed the captain for a lot of what was going on, and it kind of seemed like, yes, the captain sucked. I'm not trying to defend him because he made a lot of really terrible choices. But it seemed like the company was managing everything really horribly, was not doing proper repairs on the ship, was like, it seemed largely the company's fault. And she discussed their faults, but it did seem like she really didn't go far enough in that regard for me. And I don't know, it might have just been like a legal issue because she did mention Toad's lawyers more than once and how like hardcore they were on stuff, and like, I don't know, she was probably just trying not to get sued, but I do think Tote deserved more of the blame than this book really gave them. But it was wonderful. A little bit of like the shipping stuff and the technical terms went over my head because, again, I know nothing about this, but this book was just, it was so well written and so interesting. And like, I know that like none of my subscribers are like super into like the maritime industry and container ships, but if you like kind of just random well done nonfiction, like if you like Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer, this felt very similar just in terms of like how the story was told and how she crafted this narrative. Like it was so good. Like I feel like no one's going to read this book because like I don't care about the maritime industry, but it was really good. Like it made me care and I learned a lot about this random thing, and it was just such a good book. Like I loved it. I don't know why this became a favorite for me. Like it's so random, but like so amazing. Then I read The Laughter by Sonora Jha, which was recommended to me by Shelves of Samantha. This is an adult fiction contemporary novel set in 2016, right around the time of the presidential election, about this English professor at a university. Essentially, there are protests going on at the university in order to make it less white-centric, in order to have more diversity and less like old school, you know, whatever. And as that's going on, the professor sort of like starts up a friendship with his Muslim coworker, another professor in the law department, who is heading these protests. And her nephew is visiting from France because he got into some trouble over there, and it's just kind of devolved from there. I gave this 4 stars. This was so good. This was fantastic. I love awful main characters, and the main character in this, Dr. Oliver Harding, so awful, just like absolutely atrocious, violently sexist, racist, Islamophobic. I don't know, add whatever prejudice in there that you can. He is the narrator of this book, so you spend the entire book in his head, and it is absolutely disgusting at times and so well done. It's just so entirely justified to himself. I loved it. Absolutely wonderful. I love following around just awful people and like seeing their own justifications, and just like the way they think is so horrific but so normal to them. And it was really well done in this book. I love it when an author can capture that so well, because it is really hard to do, to like write this truly awful person in a way that feels real, because he felt really real, and I loved that. It was such a fascinating story. I loved following him. I loved seeing everything unfold, because you're kind of with him in the present, going back the last like month of everything that's happened with his coworker, with the protests, with the presidential election, and just like something bad has happened and you just don't know what it is. I don't want to talk too much about the specifics, just because there was a lot in this that I feel like you want to watch it unfold. Like going in, he is very racist. You kind of know that from the very, very beginning, regardless of how much he denies it to himself. But there's so much more than that going on, and it was wonderful. The only thing I didn't really love was the ending. I did prefer this book when it was at its most subtle. That was just like more to my taste, and the ending was like a little bit more to like the melodrama side, which like I don't think was bad by any means, just like less to my taste, but it was still really good. It was like, I absolutely loved this. Like, it was 4 stars, but it was like I was in love with this book. The writing was super pretentious, which might turn some people off, but it fits so well with the main character. Like, he is a very old school, very up himself English professor. Like, of course it's going to be pretentious because you're in his head, and it was just fantastically done. This whole book was fantastically done, and I loved it. Would definitely highly recommend. And then I listened to Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry, which is kind of an outlier here. I did not read this book. This is Matthew Perry's memoir. He was Chandler Bing on Friends, which is what he's most known for. He's since then been an actor in other things, and he has written things, and mostly done a lot of drugs, which is what this book is largely about. That would be the Big Terrible Thing that he references. I read a lot of nonfiction, and I read a lot of memoirs, and I usually don't have trouble rating them just on, like, what I got out of it. Was it enjoyable or not? Like, was it a good book? Like, not to rate other people's experiences with life, but just, like, the product that they put out. Not something I usually have an issue with, but I just don't know what to rate this book or how I feel about it. Like, I don't know that I would recommend it. It was odd. Matthew Perry has done a lot of drugs, and he is a very bitter man. And that just comes through so much in this book of just, like, he hates himself. Like, not to put it, like, bluntly, but, like, he really hates himself. Like, to this day, that was the vibe that I got from this book. He just seems so unhappy with everything, with himself, with how his life has gone, with everything he's done, and, like, he's so bitter. And I say this as a person who's not, you know, an incredibly cheery, lovely individual. I read a lot of sad books, but it was just, this left a bad taste in my mouth, and it was like, I was so, I don't want to say entertained, interested, fascinated by his story. Like, I didn't want to stop listening to it, but it was not in, like, because it was good, but because it's like when you're driving past a car wreck and your head kind of turns because you're like, oh, like, what happened there? And that was kind of the vibe that I got from this book. In terms of specifics, it kind of seems like he was lying to himself. He talks a lot about fame and about how fame isn't everything and fame isn't going to give you what you want. And, like, when he was young, he was so obsessed with fame, and then, like, fame didn't fix his life. And, like, I get that, but it kind of seems like he was still really obsessed with fame. Like, he loved name dropping people, like, constantly. He worked with Bruce Willis on a film and, like, went on and on about, like, Bruce Willis and how famous Bruce Willis is and how much Bruce Willis liked hanging out with him. And it's like, couldn't tell you a single thing about Bruce Willis or his personality based on this book, just that he's Bruce Willis and he is very famous. And it was the same thing with Julia Roberts. He dated Julia Roberts for a minute and, like, went on and on about, like, how famous she was and how she was a movie star and she won an Oscar, and could not tell you a single thing about her personality, just that she was Julia Roberts. I think he said she was smart once. That was it. Like, you really get no personality from anyone other than Matthew Perry. Like, not the people he's dated, not the people he's worked with, not his family members. Like, it's very self-absorbed, which, like, I get that it's a memoir. I read a lot of memoirs, but, like, usually you get a vibe for the people around the main character, around the author. You get to know, like, kind of who they are, like their parents or their siblings or their friends or their significant others or coworkers or, like, whatever the focus is. But, like, I got a vibe for literally no one except Matthew Perry himself. And he just told a lot of really awkward stories. Like, not negative stories, really, but, like, the vibe that I got from this book was when you're at a family reunion and you've got that one uncle or whoever, might not be an uncle, but I feel like it's usually an uncle, who just kind of drinks too much and starts saying awkward things and going into these, like, awkward stories from everyone's past, and, like, everyone listening is kind of just, like, uncomfortable. Like, it's not offensive, but it's just, like, everyone's uncomfortable with this and no one can stop him because he just kind of drinks too much. That was the vibe this book gave me. Like, the number of times he'd say things like, he would give Matt LeBlanc most improved on Friends, and it's just like, why do you feel the need to say that? Like, what does that contribute to anything? He didn't mean it as an insult. It was just kind of like, why are you sharing this? And if it was just like one or two things, like whatever, but it was just constant throughout this book where he'd just tell like kind of uncomfortable stories about people, and it's just like no one's gonna like sue him over this or have to do like damage control in like their public image. It's just like I wouldn't necessarily want someone to share like these weird random stories about, I don't know, it was a weird book. I don't know that I would really recommend it. Like, if you're interested in the story of this man who did a bunch of drugs and like hates himself, go for it. If you like Friends and Chandler Bing, don't. That's the best advice I can give. But like, it's a very bitter book. I wouldn't really recommend it, but I am glad that I read it. Then I read Lord of the Rings, all of them, which is wonderful. Finally, I've been meaning to get to these for so long, and I finally read them. I did not read them like back to back this month, but I'm gonna talk about them back to back because like it is what it is. I did a whole reading vlog for these, so if you're interested in like my more in-depth thoughts, but like it's Lord of the Rings, people generally know the vibe from these books, so I'm not gonna really go in depth. Fellowship of the Ring, I give 2 stars. Frodo finds a magic ring that needs to be destroyed because it was created by the nameless evil being who's coming to power. This was very dry and boring, and I was not a fan. All they did was walk. Like, they just walked. They walked and walked and walked, and then they sat around the council table, the Council of Elrond, and talked. And then they went back to walking after. There's basically no character development. Nothing happens. Oh, this book was a struggle. I was not a fan. And then, these are going to be very quick reviews. It's Lord of the Rings. No one cares. I read, oh, that's Return of the King. The Two Towers, which I gave 3 stars. This was significantly more enjoyable. I really loved the characters of Merry and Pippin. I really loved the development and the agency they finally got in this book. It really made them like worthwhile characters. I loved reading from them. I also really liked the growth of the relationship between Legolas and Gimli. Dwarves and elves kind of are enemies in a way in this world, and Legolas and Gimli have a lot of prejudice that they kind of like overcome and like start this really close friendship, and like you can tell how deeply they care about each other and they want to like go traveling together after these books end. Really enjoyed this one. What I realized in this book is that the characters I don't like are largely like the main characters. Like, I really dislike Frodo. Frodo is awful. He is boring, he's bland, he's annoying, he's one note. He contributes basically nothing. I don't like Gandalf because Gandalf only does things off screen and then comes back to explain what he's done. And it's like, I just want to see it happening. Like, I want to experience it. And then Aragorn is kind of nothing. I don't care about Aragorn. But like, the side characters are fantastic. Like, let's focus on them. I really enjoyed this. The first half is all about like the main A-team, I guess, and then the second half of the book is about Frodo, and that's why it only got 3 stars. But the first half was wonderful, and I really, really enjoyed it. And then I read Return of the King to finish the trilogy. So glad it's finally over. Not a fan. 3 stars, but like significantly lower 3 stars. I didn't like this one as much. There were so many kings and lords and everything that you're following. It was kind of hard to keep up with everyone. And I kind of like gave up at a point because everyone's got like a different community. You know, he's a king of these people, and this dude's a lord of these people, and this dude's a king of these people. And it's like, I just kind of, they all started running together, and I didn't care. I still don't like Frodo. The ending was weird. There were a lot of like marriages in the ending of like characters who hadn't spoken, because women don't really speak in these books very much. There's like 1 female character who has any sort of role in these books. Well, there's 2, I guess. So all the marriages at the end were kind of weird, because it's like, you had no relationship. You've never spoken before. Why are you getting married? And there were like a couple of those. And then, I don't know. I like this one a lot better in Fellowship, but like, I just find his writing really dry, and I don't really care. And I'm glad I read them. They weren't terrible books, but I will probably never, ever reread them. I also watched the movies, and I wasn't overly impressed with the movies either. Then I listened to No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age, Black and Free in America by Darnell Moore. This is a nonfiction book. It's a memoir of Darnell Moore's life growing up as a queer Black man in Camden, New Jersey, which is a very working poor Black and Latinx area, city. In case you're not from America and don't know what Camden, New Jersey is. It's not a great area, generally. I gave this 4 stars. This book is just largely about race and sexuality and class and gender and what it means to grow up in the working poor and how that's influenced his life and the violence he experienced and witnessed as a child from his father and other violence that he witnessed and experienced as a queer Black man, and just what going to college was like for him and like his career in education, because he was briefly a teacher and he's an activist now. And I don't know, it's just like his story. It's kind of hard to like explain, but like if you're interested in a book that talks a lot about like the intersectionality of being both Black and queer, this book is pretty wonderful in regards to that. He spends a lot of time just talking about like what that means to him and like the prejudices he experienced, but also the prejudices he held in regards to like other queer men, and like kind of how he felt there was a right way to be queer growing up, and how he felt like he hated himself because he was queer, and kind of how he addressed his own prejudices, which I really, really enjoy. It was a wonderful book. I will say some of the writing in this was absolutely gorgeous, and I kind of wish that I'd read a physical copy, because like there were lines that I really wish I could have just like gone back and reread, because like it was the kind of book where like I know I would have read it slower reading it physically, because I would have just like stopped and like reread particularly gorgeous sections. But it was really wonderful. I highly recommend. I don't know that it's one that will particularly stick with me, but I really, really enjoyed it at the time. Then I read The Elusive Family Secret by Ken Astley, which is unfortunately the only book I gave a negative rating this month. I gave this 2 stars. This is a historical fiction mystery book about this very wealthy family in England who has a secret, but the thing is, no one in the family knows what the secret is. The patriarch of the family dies in 1955 and tells his son before he dies there's a secret that he needs to tell him, that he needs to protect in order to keep the family safe. But he dies before he can tell the son the secret. So essentially, we check in every 22 years with this family. It's about 50 pages every 22 years as they deal with like the stress of having the secret hanging over their head and like not knowing what it is and not knowing if it's going to like ruin their lives, and like how bad is the secret. Like things happen, like they get blackmailed about it. You see the family change because it takes place from 1955 to I believe 2021. Every 22 years. It was really interesting concept. Like I really like the structure of it, but I did give it 2 stars. I had a really big issue with like the writing style in this. It felt really awkward. Like the actual like phrasing and the syntax and the word choice of it just did not ever flow right. It was one of those things that it felt like it needed severe line edits for like the entire book. So I don't want to say it was every sentence that was like that, but it was the majority of the sentences just like sounded wrong when I was reading them, and that was like my biggest issue overall. The other main issue I had was with the characters. Because you're checking in every 22 years, you're following the family through generations, and it kind of like adds a lot of characters because of that, because you've got like, you know, the main guy from 1955, and then you check in 22 years later and like his son is grown up and has like a friend and a sister and a girlfriend and like all these characters, and then you check in 22 years later and you know the original man is still on the cast, his son, his son's wife, his son's kids friends, his, you know, and it just like exponentially grows with each generation. And because there were so many characters and the book was so short and like you know checked in with them so infrequently, I kind of had trouble keeping up with who everyone was. And most of it was just like the size of the cast, but part of it also was because I didn't really feel like they had distinct personalities or motivations. I couldn't really tell them apart, which was unfortunate. And I really wish there'd been more development of the time periods themselves, because 1955 really didn't feel any different than the 90s or the 2020s. And I wish it had been, because it was such an interesting way to tell a story and such an interesting premise, like to just cover generations of this family. Like I really, really enjoyed that in the concept. I just don't think it was executed very well. But yeah, I don't know. This book was kind of disappointing to me because it had so much potential and just nothing really worked right for me. But it was still like interesting. I was down to like follow the family and like figure out what the secret was, but I just didn't think it was particularly well executed, which was very disappointing. Then I read Out There into the Queer New Yonder by Saundra Mitchell, or edited by Saundra Mitchell. This is a short story collection of YA science fiction stories. I've been reading this series for a minute. There's a contemporary book and a historical fiction book in addition to this one. I gave this 3 stars, which is kind of par for the course with these books. I gave the contemporary one 2 stars, and I gave the historical fiction one 3 stars as well. I just didn't love them. I think one of the main issues is that a lot of these authors seem to be novelists for the main part, and you write short stories completely different than you write novels. Like, it has to be a different structure. And because a lot of these authors seem like novelists, it really made the short stories just feel like scenes from a larger work instead of like standalone pieces, which was very disappointing because like I love short stories. I just didn't think these were very well done. But I did enjoy a number of them. For this collection, most of the short stories were fine, a few were pretty good. None of them really stood out to me as being wonderful, which was really disappointing. This collection was fine. I kind of regret reading all 3 of these. This was the one that I was really interested in reading, because science fiction makes for really interesting short stories, because it allows you to really delve into this really small, random, like, sci-fi concept, either like speculative or like hardcore sci-fi. And I love that, but like I read the others first and they were all kind of like middling to not great. And this one was kind of the same. I don't have much to say about it. I already don't remember any of the stories, any of the authors. Like, some of them were decent, some of them I enjoyed, but I didn't love any of them, and I don't remember any of them, unfortunately. Then the final book that I read this month was Blindsighted by Karin Slaughter. I love this, no one is surprised. I love Karin Slaughter. This is her debut novel, which is really interesting to read because I've read all of her later work and just haven't read her very first 6-book series, so I'm doing that this summer to finally finish her out and get to enjoy her again because I love her. This is the first book in the Grant County series and her debut novel. Wonderful. I gave it 4 stars. This is about Dr. Sarah Linton, who is both the pediatrician and the mortician. She does the autopsies. The coroner. That's the word I'm looking for. She's the town coroner, as well as she owns a pediatrician practice and works with kids. So she does both of those things. Her ex-husband is the chief of police, and they're kind of working together. There's also a main character who is a detective on the police force, Lena Adams, who's not a great person. You're kind of supposed to hate her, but like you don't. All the characters are awful people, which is kind of like par for the course with her books. I would say they're less awful people in this than like necessarily later on, except for Lena. I think you're kind of supposed to like Sarah and Jeffrey, but like you really don't. I love this. I don't know what to say. Like, 4 stars. It was so wonderful. Like, I love these characters. I love how unlikable everyone is. I love just how awful everything is. Like, these are so brutal and so graphic and just like awful. So awful and like disgusting, and like it was horrifying to read. Karin Slaughter is brutal in all of her books, but she's definitely started out more brutal early on. This is probably the most brutal of her books that I have read and the most horrifyingly graphic. I really enjoyed it. She's so good at making you as the reader feel uncomfortable and just like disgusted by everything that's happening, but still like fascinated and in love with the story. I love the characters. I love how awful they are. I love seeing their perspectives and just like they're so like justified in their own minds of like they're doing the right thing, and then you switch to like another character's perspective and they're like, why would anyone do that? That's horrible. As they're like also doing this other like equally horrible yet entirely different thing, and like they're all so distinct personality wise, and she's just, I love her characters. And I really do like that this is focused in a small town, because I do feel like it allows for more growth like and world building, whereas the Will Trent series, which I also love by her, is set in Atlanta, which is a large city, so like there's less specific world building that happens like between the books, because like every case is like so separate, like you're not overlapping in terms of like setting or anything. I don't know, I like the small town vibe. I liked everything. 4 stars. Like the plot of this, like the actual mystery plot, was not like the most amazing thing I've ever read, but like I don't read her for the actual like crime mysteries. I read her for the characters who are investigating them, and they were so well done. This made me happy. I'm immediately reading more of them. This will be my summer project, and I'm gonna have a great time. So highly recommend if you like brutal crime thrillers. So that was everything that I read in the month of May. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them if you have, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.